At 0917, on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had been mocking for 6 straight weeks. 27 years old, Illinois state shooting champion, and exactly 0 confirmed kills in combat. But that was about to change in a way that would make those same officers eat every word of ridicule they'd thrown his way. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves, and in the past 72 hours, those invisible killers had taken down 14 men from George's regiment, 14 American soldiers who never saw it coming, 14 families back home who'd get that telegram no family wanted to receive, 14 mothers who'd collapse when the Western Union man knocked on their door. And George's commanding officer? He'd called George's rifle a toy. The other platoon leaders had a different name for it. They called it his mail-order sweetheart. Said it with that condescending tone that suggests a man doesn't know the difference between a deer hunt back home and actual war. Here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you something to prove. And John George was about to prove it in the most definitive way possible. In a way that would save American lives and change military doctrine about individual marksmanship. When he'd unpacked that Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Is this thing meant for deer or Germans?" the guy had asked, turning the rifle over in his hands with visible skepticism. George had explained, calm as could be, that it was for the Japanese. The armorer had just shaken his head, like George didn't understand what he was getting himself into. But then his unit shipped out before the rifle arrived. Can you imagine that? You spend 2 years of National Guard pay, money you've been saving from every paycheck, on the perfect rifle, and it doesn't even make it onto the boat with you. So there's George, crossing the Pacific on a troop ship packed with thousands of men, watching every other man in his battalion clean their standard-issue M1 Garens while his custom rifle sits in some warehouse back in Illinois gathering dust. He requested it be forwarded through military mail, filling out the paperwork, explaining to supply sergeants who didn't care. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle he'd dreamed about using, still packed in cosmoline, still perfect. Now, let's talk about why everyone thought George was crazy. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garand that every other man in his battalion carried, 9.5 pounds, with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds before you needed to reload. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. On paper, it looked like George had brought a hunting rifle to a gunfight. Captain Morris flat out ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. He'd disobey a direct order because he knew something Captain Morris didn't. You've got to respect that kind of quiet defiance, that confidence in your own judgment. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. Those Marines had been fighting since August. 4 months of continuous combat in jungle conditions that broke men physically and mentally. They'd taken Henderson Field, they'd held it through hell itself, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't cleared the Japanese from those coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it something else, but to the Americans, it was just another piece of real estate that needed taking. 500 enemy soldiers, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 straight days. 16 days of jungle warfare where you couldn't see your enemy until it was too late. Where the jungle itself seemed to be trying to kill you just as much as the Japanese soldiers hiding in it. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd. And you know how many times George had fired his Winchester in combat during all that? 0. Not once. The rifle he'd spent 2 years saving for, the rifle he'd had shipped halfway around the world, the rifle he'd argued about with Captain Morris, hadn't fired a single shot in anger. The jungle around Point Cruz was different, though. No bunkers, no fixed positions. Just Japanese soldiers who'd retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into those massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers, professional killers. They had scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle like you know your own neighborhood, every tree, every sight line, every hiding spot. They knew how to wait, how to become part of the landscape, how to kill you before you even knew they were there. That patience, that deadly professionalism, that's what made them so dangerous. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was just filling canteens at a creek. Think about that for a second. A man doing one of the most basic, necessary tasks of survival, getting water so he and his buddies wouldn't die of dehydration in that tropical heat. And he never saw it coming. One moment he's kneeling by the creek, the next he's dead. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. Good men, experienced soldiers, gone in seconds. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. Twice! That's the psychological warfare of sniper combat right there. The understanding that you might have already passed your killer without knowing it. The battalion commander summoned George that night. The man was desperate. His men were dying faster from Japanese snipers than from malaria, and in the Pacific Theater, malaria was killing soldiers by the hundreds. That's saying something. He needed someone who could actually shoot, someone who could hunt these hunters. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could hit anything besides paper targets back in Illinois. George laid out his credentials without boasting, just facts. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. 23 years old at the time, youngest winner in the state's history. A record that still stood, 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards, consistent, repeatable, accuracy under field conditions. The commander gave him until morning to prove it wasn't all talk, that he could actually deliver under combat stress. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am telling it, do me a favor, hit that like button. I know. Everyone asks for likes, but here's why it actually matters. YouTube's algorithm is simple. The more likes this video gets, the more the platform shows it to people who care about history, who care about the men who fought in these forgotten battles. Without your like, this story stays buried in the archives. With it, we honor men like John George by making sure their actions aren't forgotten by history. That's all I'm asking. One click to make sure this reaches the people who need to hear it, who need to understand what these men did for us. George spent the night checking his rifle, every component, every moving part. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again, methodically, removing every trace of the preservative. He checked the scope mounts, making sure nothing had loosened during transport or storage. He loaded 5 rounds of 30-06 hunting ammunition he'd packed back in Tennessee. Same cartridge the Garand fired, but loaded to his own specifications with powder charges he'd worked out through years of testing. At dawn, on January 22nd, George moved into position in those ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that area, banyan trees, ancient, massive trees. Some of them reached 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one of those trees before dawn and sit there all day without being seen. Perfect concealment, perfect fields of fire. It was perfect sniper terrain, exactly the kind of environment where a skilled marksman, with patience, could control an entire sector. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle and a canteen and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into that bunker and began to watch the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. That doesn't sound like much in today's world of 10 power and 20 power scopes, with range-finding reticles and parallax adjustment, but in 1943, it was cutting-edge civilian technology, and it was enough to see movement in branches that the naked eye would completely miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the distant sound of artillery rumbling like thunder on the horizon. It's like white noise that never stops, never gives you a moment of quiet to think. George had learned to filter it all out and focus on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, methodically, left to right, top to bottom, the way a professional does it. No rushing, no shortcuts. At 0917, he saw it. A branch moved. No wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched without moving, barely breathing. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. The sniper had no idea George was watching him. No idea that death was looking at him through a Lyman Alaskan scope at that very moment. George adjusted his scope with practiced movements. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing like he'd done 1,000 times on the range back home. In and out, steady, finding that natural pause between breaths where your body is still. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds of pull. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war, getting it exactly right. Now he'd find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained by the Japanese military to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder with that familiar recoil he knew so well. The sound cracked through the jungle, cutting through the white noise of insects and birds. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through those branches, his body tumbling 90 feet before it hit the ground near the base of that banyan tree with a thud George couldn't hear but could imagine. George worked the bolt with smooth efficiency, that empty cartridge ejected with a metallic clink. He chambered another round, kept his scope on the tree, waited for movement. Nothing. But George knew something the average soldier might not. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. Standard operating procedure. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the trees nearby, and that spotter had just watched his partner die, watched him fall 90 feet to his death. George scanned the surrounding banyans with renewed focus. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. This wasn't target shooting at Camp Perry anymore. This was chess with rifles, where the loser died. At 0943, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard that shot and knew his position was compromised. Smart man, tactically sound decision, but not quite smart enough or fast enough. George aimed, led the movement slightly to account for the sniper's descent, fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him, tumbling end over end. Both man and rifle hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George had just announced to every Japanese soldier in those groves that someone new was hunting them, someone who could see them when they thought they were invisible. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, no shaking, no adrenaline making him clumsy. His breathing was controlled. This wasn't different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. That was the only variable that changed. The fundamentals remained the same. Breathing, trigger control, follow through. The basics never changed whether you were shooting paper or men. At 1,121, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt and sand into his face, stinging his eyes. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall, his heart pounding now. That had been close. Too close. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first two snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. Time has a different quality when someone's trying to kill you. 3 minutes feels like 30. Every second stretches out. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine that every military in the world taught. Shoot and relocate. Never stay in the same position, but in a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. The sniper was still in there somewhere, probably congratulating himself on that near miss, probably already scanning for George's position, lining up for another shot. George found him at 1,138. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A mistake. A fatal mistake. Maybe he thought George couldn't see him through the foliage. Maybe he thought the thick leaves and branches would hide him. Maybe he just got impatient or overconfident. Doesn't matter. George put the crosshairs on that dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion faster than jungle rot, faster than malaria, faster than any rumor had ever spread. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle were now asking if they could watch him work. George refused every request. He wasn't being arrogant, he was being tactical. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The last thing he needed was a crowd of curious soldiers making him a target, giving away his position. The Japanese snipers adapted after that 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. It was like they collectively decided that movement meant death, so they'd wait George out. They'd stay completely still, trusting their concealment, hoping George couldn't find them if they didn't move. He spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing but branches and leaves and shadows. At 1,600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice, completely gone, replaced by something else: respect. He wanted George back in position at dawn. You know what I love about this story? It's about a man who believed in himself when nobody else did. How many times in your life have you been in that position? You know you're right, you know what you're capable of, but everyone around you is telling you you're wrong. They're calling your ideas toys or impractical or stupid. That's where character shows up. That's where you find out what you're made of. Whether you'll fold under that pressure or stand firm in what you know to be true. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. A gray wall of water that made observation impossible. George sat in that bunker and waited for the weather to clear. Patience. Always patience. The rain stopped at 0815. By 0845, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 0912. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart, tactical thinking. The sound of rain masked movement, masked the scraping of boots on bark, masked everything. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. Also, smart. They were learning his capabilities, studying his patterns, adjusting their tactics accordingly. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The 6th kill. What happened next, George hadn't anticipated. At 0957, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They'd triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. Good work by their forward observers. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George did the math in his head instantly. The third salvo would hit the bunker. Simple ballistics. He grabbed his rifle and ran without hesitation. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. As the third salvo hit, The bunker he'd occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. Rock and sandbags and pieces of Japanese construction material rained down across the area like deadly hail. George had missed death by maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds between life and a direct hit. He relocated to a different position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. Now they were hunting him back. The dynamic had changed completely. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. This was personal. At 1,423, George killed his 7th sniper. At 1,541, he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet, up a banyan tree. Good concealment, excellent field of view. But the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. It's the little details that get you killed in sniper work. One small mistake. That Japanese soldier made one small mistake and paid for it with his life. At 1,700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. 9 hours of constant vigilance, constant scanning, constant readiness. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 8 kills, 4 misses. That's a 67% hit rate in combat conditions at ranges up to 300 yards with a bolt-action rifle. Better than most trained military snipers could manage. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves, according to intelligence reports. 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who'd survived the longest, who'd made the fewest mistakes. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. They'd be ready for him. They'd be planning. They'd be dangerous. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 0300, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. Sleep wouldn't come. Too much adrenaline, too much awareness that tomorrow would be harder. The rain started again at 0415. By 0530, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop, checking his rifle again, running through scenarios in his mind. Look, I need to pause here for a second. If you're enjoying this story, if you're feeling that connection to what these men went through, I want you to do something simple. Subscribe to this channel. Here's why it matters to me personally. Every single day, stories like John George's are being forgotten. The men who fought in the Pacific, the individual acts of courage that don't make it into history books, they're disappearing from collective memory. When you subscribe, you're telling YouTube's algorithm that this content matters. You're helping me reach more people who care about preserving these stories. That's it. That's all I'm asking. One click to make sure we don't forget the men who gave everything for us. One click to honor their sacrifice. At 0743, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing trees. At 0817 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only 40 feet up. Unusual for a sniper. Most snipers climbed high for better sightlines and longer range. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. Perfect camouflage. But George wasn't at ground level. He was elevated on those rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them easily. Unless it was bait. Unless this was a trap. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees with renewed caution. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. This was advanced tactics. This was the kind of thing that separated the professionals from the amateurs. This was high-level sniper warfare. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of that palm. No rushing, no assumptions. It took 11 minutes. Patient work. At 0828, he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. Time was not on George's side. George decided to use the bait against them. Brilliant tactical thinking. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree, 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. Human nature. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on that dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching, to any other Japanese soldiers in the area. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran without hesitation. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited, heart pounding. At 0834, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. Discipline over panic. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into that crater with water up to his chest. Cold water, muddy water. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning his own moves. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible, but not always identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch or a man. Every shadow could be concealment or just shadow. George had to study each one carefully, methodically. This was the patience that defined sniper work. The ability to look at the same trees for hours and notice the one thing that didn't belong. At 0947, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. Different tactics. Adapting. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. Smart use of terrain. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. This was a different kind of warfare. This was a hunter who decided to close the distance and kill his prey up close. George remained motionless in that water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 0952. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work. The ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 0958, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the same side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic perfectly. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. It was almost respectful, this deadly game of chess they were playing. At 1003, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot even, without a scope. A shot he'd made thousands of times in practice. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He'd outlived 10 other snipers. Men who'd been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position, another trap. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 1006, George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, wasn't repositioning, just watching, waiting with predatory stillness. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. Either way, George couldn't shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach, something unexpected. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. Cold water, mud, the patient stillness of a predator waiting for prey. At 1013, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. No movement, no targets. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position through systematic searching. George remained in that water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water. Slowly, silently, water dripping from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder and aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt with practiced efficiency, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle, realizing the danger. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. The mail-order rifle that everyone had mocked had just won a sniper duel against some of the best-trained marksmen in the Japanese military. Vindication in its purest form. But as George climbed out of that crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, methodical even in victory, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers hadn't been working alone. There was always more trouble coming. We're going to take a quick break in the action here because I want to make sure you understand what happens next. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten history, if you appreciate the level of detail we're bringing to these stories, hit that subscribe button. These stories take hours of research, writing, and production. Your subscription tells me this work matters. It tells me there are people out there who care about preserving the memory of men like John George. That's all I'm asking for. A simple subscription to help keep these stories alive for future generations. George dropped back into that crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling, urgent conversation. These weren't snipers. They were infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds. Time moves differently when you're hiding from men who want to kill you. Every second feels like an hour. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones probably, discussing what had happened. At 1028, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. A basic mistake that might cost him his life. The kind of mistake that gets you killed in combat. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options quickly. Stay hidden and hope they pass by. Or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards. 25 yards, 20 yards, every step bringing them closer to his position. At 1031, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down, directly at George. Their eyes met. For a split second, both men were frozen. Then training took over. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. Panic fire. George stayed low. He glassed the area through his scope, saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. His last 2 rounds. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision instantly. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. Survival over engagement. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face, leaving cuts. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued aggressively. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. He'd have to leave it. At 1047, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 1113, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through the wire. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. Everything that had happened, George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional, but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. But it had performed flawlessly. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George's war against the snipers was over. Mission accomplished. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped that Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component, cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. The rifle that had saved his life deserved that respect. At 1,400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. All violations that could result in discipline. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time and rifles with optics and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with Unertl scopes. Sniper rifles left behind by the Marines when they rotated out. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas, turn individual excellence into institutional capability. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request without hesitation. Here's what I love about this moment. George had proven himself in the most definitive way possible. He'd taken a rifle that everyone mocked and used it to save lives. He'd killed 11 enemy snipers in 4 days with a bolt-action sporting rifle. And now the military wanted him to teach others. That's vindication. That's the sweetest kind of success. Not just proving yourself, but being asked to show others how to do what you did. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with Unertl scopes went to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They'd qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. None of them understood the psychological aspect of sniper warfare. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind, estimating range. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the unertl scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. Realistic training for realistic conditions. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions, good enough for combat operations. George divided them into 16 two-man teams: shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. Redundancy built into the system. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't yet evacuated. Still dangerous. Still capable of killing American soldiers. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 0720, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The training had worked. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative, only counted confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through. Muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Lucky. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. Standard recovery time. If you're still with me, if this story has grabbed you the way it grabbed me when I first researched it, I want to ask you for something. Subscribe to this channel if you like what you're hearing. That's it, simple as that. We're diving deep into forgotten stories from World War II, bringing you the kind of detailed, respectful storytelling that these veterans deserve. Your subscription helps us continue this work. It helps us reach more people who care about history. 1 click. That's all I'm asking for. 1 click to preserve these stories. George spent 2 weeks at that field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star for his leadership and innovation. But George's war was not finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission, something in Burma, something classified, something dangerous. George volunteered without hesitation. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth, ready for whatever came next. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment in a secure tent. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307th Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943. But the men had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operations without supply lines, missions that would make Guadalcanal look easy by comparison. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods, disrupting supply lines, gathering intelligence, creating chaos. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as sniper. The Army didn't have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse. Steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. They would be operating in the enemy's backyard. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered when you're carrying everything on your back. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification but weighed 8 ounces less. Every ounce counted. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. Your back felt every ounce by day 5. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Miat Kiaina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops who knew every trail and every river crossing. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. That was the plan. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all, supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles and mortars and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain, speed and stealth over firepower. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents, the sounds of gunshots echoing through the valleys. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They'd engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights, followed by rapid withdrawal. The marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines and create chaos behind Japanese positions. Hit-and-run tactics. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once, at 412 yards, against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards, against a machine gun position that had pinned down an advance element. Once at 290 yards, against a sniper who had pinned down a marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. The Winchester still delivering. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. One shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately, fire and displace, never stay in the same position. The march to meet Kiana took 3 months. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. They'd lost more men to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, tropical diseases that killed as surely as bullets. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effectives. The jungle had claimed the rest. On May 17th, the marauders captured Kiana airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. The men were walking skeletons. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. Different kind of warfare. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics. The individual marksman was becoming less relevant as automatic weapons proliferated. But there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. His war was over. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. Passing knowledge to the next generation. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The numbers didn't matter anymore. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. Mass production and standardization were winning the war. The military was standardizing everything: mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale, millions of men with standardized equipment. But something was being lost: the individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. That was fading into history. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics, graduated with highest honors in 1950, building a new life in peacetime. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Service Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. A distinguished career far from the jungles of Guadalcanal. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the Japanese snipers. They didn't know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. The war was something private. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh in his mind. The sounds, the smells, the decisions. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages, a comprehensive record of Pacific combat. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical, detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics, not the kind of content that interested general readers. But the NRA convinced him that shooters and historians would value the information. The book was published in 1948 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what didn't work in combat. Honest assessment from someone who'd been there. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. Primary source material of the highest quality. If you've made it this far, if you've spent this time with me learning about John George and his mail-order rifle that proved everyone wrong, I want to ask you one final favor. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. That's all. These stories matter. The men who fought in forgotten battles, who were underestimated and mocked, who proved themselves through skill and courage, they deserve to be remembered. Your subscription helps make sure that happens. One click to honor a man who refused to let anyone tell him he wasn't good enough. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers, history repeating its patterns. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. A relic of a different time. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. Worn wood, blued steel, nothing particularly special to the untrained eye. But it's not. It's the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. A piece of history disguised as a hunting rifle. You know what gets me about this story? It's not just about the rifle or the kills or the tactics. It's about a man who believed in himself when nobody else did. Captain Morris called his rifle a toy. Other officers called it his mail-order sweetheart. The armorer wondered if he was hunting deer or going to war. Everyone doubted him. Everyone except John George himself. And sometimes that's all you need. And he didn't let that doubt change what he knew to be true. He knew he could shoot. He knew his rifle. He knew that if given the chance, he could make a difference. So when his commanding officer finally gave him that chance, George delivered in a way that shut down every skeptic, every doubter, every officer who'd mocked his equipment. Results that couldn't be argued with. That's the lesson here. That's what we can take from this story 80 years later. When you know what you're capable of, when you've put in the work and built the skill, don't let other people's doubt become your doubt. Prove them wrong through action. Show them through results. Let your performance speak louder than their skepticism. That's how you win. George didn't argue with Captain Morris about the Winchester. He didn't try to convince the other platoon leaders that his mail-order rifle was legitimate. He just waited for his opportunity and then executed. 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days. 1 rifle, 1 man. Undeniable results that changed minds instantly. I think about that in my own life. How many times have we all been in situations where people doubted us? Where they looked at our tools, or our methods, or our approach and said it wouldn't work? Where they called our ideas, toys, or mail-order sweethearts, or laughed at our ambitions? That's when character shows up. That's when you find out what you're made of, whether you'll fold under pressure or stand firm. George could have left that Winchester in his tent. He could have carried the Garand like Captain Morris ordered. He could have fit in, followed the standard procedures, done what everyone else was doing. But he didn't. He carried that rifle anyway because he knew something the others didn't. He knew what he could do with it, and that confidence made all the difference. And when the Japanese snipers were killing 14 Americans in 72 hours, when the battalion was desperate for a solution, George was ready. Not because he got lucky, because he'd been preparing for years, because he'd spent 2 years of National Guard pay on the right equipment, because he'd practiced at Camp Perry until his trigger pull was glass smooth, because he'd studied the fundamentals until they were second nature. Preparation, meeting, opportunity. That's the real story here. Overnight success that took years of preparation. The moment when skill meets opportunity, and everyone who doubted you has to watch you succeed. And they can't say anything because the results speak for themselves. George, sitting in that bunker at Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree through a scope his officers had mocked, knowing the Japanese sniper had no idea what was coming. The Winchester's recoil into his shoulder, the sniper falling 90 feet through those branches, the vindication of being right when everyone said you were wrong. That moment when everything you believed about yourself is proven true. That first shot changed everything. Captain Morris stopped mocking. The other platoon leaders stopped calling it a mail-order sweetheart. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what that civilian rifle could do. Suddenly, George wasn't the guy with a toy gun. He was the guy who could solve the problem nobody else could solve. Respect earned through performance. And here's what I love. George didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in anyone's face. He just kept working. 11 snipers, over 4 days. Then training other men. Then Burma. Then a distinguished career after the war. No ego, no bragging, just consistent excellence. That's class. That's how you carry yourself when you've proven the doubters wrong. You don't need to talk about it. The results speak for themselves. Your work is your argument. The Winchester Model 70 sitting in that museum in Virginia represents something bigger than one rifle or one man or one campaign. It represents the idea that individual excellence still matters. That skill and preparation and the right tools in the right hands can change outcomes. That you don't need the biggest gun or the most expensive equipment or the military's approval to make a difference. You just need to be exceptionally good at what you do. You just need to be good at what you do. Really good. Undeniably good. Good enough that when the moment comes, you deliver without hesitation. George delivered. 11 enemy snipers who'd been terrorizing an entire battalion. 11 confirmed kills with 12 rounds fired. A 92% hit rate in combat conditions. 0 American casualties during his 4 days of operations. That's not luck. That's mastery. That's the result of years of practice and dedication. And it all started with a mail-order rifle that everyone laughed at. A toy, a sweetheart, a hunting rifle in a war zone. Until it wasn't. Until it became the most effective counter-sniper weapon in that sector of Guadalcanal. Until it proved that the man matters more than the machine. Until it saved American lives and changed military thinking. I don't know about you, but I find that inspiring. In a world that often feels like it's moving toward standardization, toward everyone using the same tools and following the same processes and thinking the same thoughts, stories like John George's remind us that individual excellence hasn't gone out of style, that believing in yourself and your abilities and your judgment can still lead to extraordinary results, that you don't have to follow the crowd to be successful. The Japanese snipers in those Point Cruz groves were professionals. They'd been trained for jungle warfare at specialized schools. They knew the terrain intimately. They had good equipment. They were smart, patient, skilled, everything you'd want in a sniper, and they'd successfully killed 14 Americans in 3 days. They were winning until George showed up. Then George showed up with his mail-order rifle and killed all 11 of them in 4 days, because he was better, because he'd prepared more thoroughly, because he understood fundamentals that transcended equipment and training and doctrine. Breathing control, trigger, squeeze, reading wind, patience, observation, the ability to stay calm when people are trying to kill you. The basics executed at the highest level. Those are timeless skills. They mattered in 1943 and they matter today. Not the specific application of shooting enemy snipers, but the underlying principles. Excellence in your craft, confidence in your abilities, the patience to wait for your moment, the execution when that moment arrives. Those principles transfer to any field. George waiting in that water-filled crater for the 11th sniper, submerged up to his eyes, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear, watching 2 Japanese soldiers walk past him, waiting, then rising from the water like some avenging ghost and taking both of them down before they could react. Ice-cold nerve. That's not something you can teach in basic training. That's experience and judgment and ice in your veins. That's the difference between a good soldier and someone who becomes a legend. That's what separates the professionals from everyone else. The men in George's unit started calling him by name after that 4th day. Not Lieutenant George or that guy with the weird rifle, just George, with respect in their voices, because he'd done something they couldn't do. He'd solved a problem that was killing them. He'd proven his value in the most definitive way possible. That's all any of us can ask for in life, the opportunity to prove ourselves, to show what we're capable of when given the chance, to vindicate the faith we have in ourselves even when nobody else shares it, to turn doubters into believers through undeniable performance. George got that chance at Point Cruz, and he didn't waste it. 11 enemy snipers, 74 more in the weeks that followed as he trained others, the Bronze Star, the respect of his battalion, a place in military history, all because he refused to leave his mail-order rifle in the tent, all because he trusted himself when nobody else did. I'm telling you this story because I think we all need to hear it sometimes. When you're doubted, when people mock your tools, or your methods, or your dreams, when the established way of doing things doesn't align with what you know is right, remember John George. Remember that civilian rifle that outperformed military snipers. Remember that patience and skill and preparation matter more than approval from people who don't understand what you're doing. And if you've found value in this story, if it's made you think or feel or remember something important, hit that subscribe button, because these stories matter. The John Georges of World War II, the men who were underestimated and who proved everyone wrong, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told with the detail and respect they earn through their actions. Your subscription makes that possible. That's what we do here. We dig into the archives, find the forgotten stories, and bring them back to life with respect and attention to detail. We honor the men who made a difference, who showed courage and skill and character when it mattered most. Your subscription helps us continue that work. It helps us reach more people who care about history, who want to learn from the past, who understand that these stories are worth preserving for future generations. John George died in 2009 at 90 years old. His rifle sits in a museum where most people walk past without understanding its significance. His book is still in print, but most people have never heard of him. Most people don't know about Point Cruz or the 11 Japanese snipers or the mail-order rifle that changed everything. That's what we're trying to fix. One story at a time, one video at a time, one subscription at a time, keeping history alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about history enough to spend this time with me. Thank you for helping make sure John, George, and men like him aren't forgotten by future generations. These men gave everything they had. The least we can do is remember them and tell their stories honestly. And that starts with you, right here, right now. Subscribe, share this video, tell someone about John George and his Winchester Model 70. Keep the story alive. That's all I'm asking. Keep their memory alive so they're never truly gone.